I understood my secret had been sold the exact moment I stepped through my mother's dining room doorway, and felt the whole room pause in that very quiet, very polite, very American way. The kind of pause you would probably miss if you had not grown up in a family that used dinner to keep everything looking normal. No one jumped to their feet. No one questioned me right away. My mother simply set her fork down beside her plate of roast chicken, her eyes lifting a beat slower than usual. Dean, my cousin, leaned one shoulder against the oak buffet with a glass of red wine in his hand, his expression so indifferent it was almost insulting. Aunt Ruth, my mother's sister, sat at the far end of the table with her hand laid flat over her napkin, as if she were in a church committee meeting instead of Sunday dinner. And Paige, my best friend of 14 years, stood near the kitchen counter in a cream sweater, holding the salad bowl, turning toward me with a smile so gentle an outsider would have felt relieved to see at least one kind face in the room. That smile was what sent the cold from the base of my neck straight down my spine. Not because it was cruel. Paige never did anything that crudely. She never had. She only ever appeared in the moments when other people needed a breath, a soft phrase, a face that understood. And by doing that, she slid herself into the middle of their stories until one day no one could tell the difference between the truth as first told and the version retold by her. I had not even taken off my coat before my mother said, very quietly but loudly enough for the whole table to hear, "Nora, you should have told everyone from the beginning." I stopped short in the middle of the kitchen, full of the smell of garlic in oil, roast chicken, and buttered bread, still holding my bag strap, and it took my second to connect her words to the only thing that could explain them. The house on Willow Street, Aunt Evelyn's bakery, the lawyer's letter, the will read yesterday, and the one name I had told that secret to. Paige set the salad bowl down, took 2 steps toward me, and in a voice soft as a hand against the back of someone panicking, said, "We're not attacking you. Everyone's just confused." I looked at her, then around the circle of faces already reacting to me not as themselves reacting to me, but as people reacting to a version of me someone else had prepared for them beforehand. And I understood immediately, with a coldness so sharp it was almost clarifying, that the only person who had known is besides me and my aunt's lawyer was Paige. And Paige had not simply told my secret. She had told it in a way that made me walk into my mother's house looking like someone hiding something, calculating, planning something shameful. That was the moment everything broke. Not when Aunt Evelyn died, not when I found out I was the only person she had left the house, and the bakery too, but when I realized the one person I had placed my secret into had not dropped. She had opened her hand at exactly the right place, at exactly the right moment, and let my whole family look at it under a light that made me instantly seem guilty. Aunt Evelyn died at the end of October, in a hospital room that looked out over the yellowed parking lot behind the nursing home, after 6 months of pancreatic cancer had stripped nearly all the flesh from her cheekbones, but had not managed to take away the way her eyes still fixed on you, cold and direct, whenever she thought you were Ying. She was my father's youngest sister, and she had spent her whole life in a river town 40 minutes from my mother's house. In the old 2-story building that sat directly above the bakery she opened when she was 33 after a short marriage, and a decision stubborn enough that my family had never really gotten over it. Evelyn was always dramatic, my mother still said every time she mentioned her, but there was always something close to envy in her voice, whether she recognized it or not. Aunt Evelyn was not rich, not polished. She did not know how to make everyone comfortable at dinner the way my mother did. She spoke plainly, laughed loudly, wore oversized earrings, forgot to answer invitations, hated performative charity, and had this habit of looking at a person just a little too long if she thought they were trying to rearrange reality with elegant language. But she was also the only person in the family who ever treated me as though I did not need to shrink myself to be lovable. When I was little, anytime things at home got too tense, anytime my mother and father fought in voices so low they were more dangerous than shouting, I would be taken to Aunt Evelyn's bakery and sat on a tall stool in the back kitchen to eat broken pies, breathe in cinnamon and butter, and listen to her swear about taxes, flour vendors, and private school mothers who loved handing out advice more than they loved living honest lives. She never once asked me to be better behaved, gentler, or less inconvenient so I would fit into a room more easily. She only asked if I was hungry. When I was 26 and had just quit a marketing job in Philadelphia because I hated the feeling of pinning a smile to something I did not believe in every single day, she was the one who said, Good. At least you can still hear when your life starts to rot. Later, I went back, took a few management classes, worked at an independent publisher, then moved into brand consulting for local food businesses. But I think in her eyes, the important thing was never what I did. It was that I refused to let other people decide the shape of my whole life and call it maturity. The day the lawyer read my aunt's will, I still thought the worst shock had already passed with losing her. I sat in Harold Whitmore's dark wood office, holding a cooling paper cup of coffee, looking out at the small town window streaked with soft rain, expecting to hear a modest division of assets. A little money to the church, a little to a trade scholarship. The house sold and split among relatives, the bakery closed or transferred. That is how families like mine operate. They do not keep a place intact. They divide it so that no one has to feel too obviously mistreated. But Aunt Evelyn did what she had always done best, which was throw the truth straight onto the table and let everyone else decide whether to call it cruel or brave. Harold took off his glasses and looked at me like he was about to place something in my hands heavier than it appeared. My aunt had left the entire house on Willow Street, the bakery downstairs, the recipes, the equipment, the business reserve accounts, and the right to decide the future of all of it to me. Only me. Not divided with Dean, not co-managed by my mother, no family board, no shared trust, just me. I still remember gripping the coffee cup so hard the plastic lid popped loose on one side, and hot brown liquid ran over my thumb without me even feeling it. "Is there some mistake?" was the first thing I said, and Harold gave me a sad, near smile because I had asked exactly what my aunt predicted I would. He handed me the letter she had left in her own hand, the writing shaky but still forceful, the dark blue ink slightly blurred near the bottom of the page. She wrote no more than 2 pages, but it was enough to push everything out of the range of convenience. She wrote that for years, my family had looked at the bakery more like a pretty piece of property on a map than the life it had sustained for her after her divorce. She wrote that Dean had approached her twice in the last 3 years to discuss commercial redevelopment options, a polite way of saying tear the bakery down, put in a new storefront, add a wine bar, rent out the upper floor. She wrote that my mother had once said, in a way so exactly my mother it hurt to read, that maybe it's time to do something less sentimental with it. And then she wrote the line that hurt most, the one that made me fold the letter shut halfway through just to breathe. "You are the only one who has never looked at this place as something to optimize. You have looked at it as a place. The only person who understands a place is the one allowed to keep it." Along with the letter, there was also a sealed packet of supporting documents, and Harold rested his hand over it and told me, slowly and clearly, that my aunt had anticipated a dispute. Inside were records of old meetings, emails, independent confirmations of ownership, and several fallback documents to be opened only if anyone tried to drag the property into some fair family resolution process. Even then, I felt afraid, but not because of the responsibility. I was afraid of the reaction, afraid of how my mother would look at the word everything. Afraid Dean would see the house and the bakery as money trapped behind glass. Afraid the emotional weather of the family would change overnight. And because of that fear, I did something painfully human, painfully understandable, and in the end more expensive than any mistake I had ever made. I called Paige. Paige picked up on the first ring, as she always did. She was always quick to answer things that smelled private. We had been friends since I was 20, when we interned together at an independent bookstore in Center City. Both of us broke, both convinced we were too smart to live the lives mainline mothers had mapped out for us. Paige had the kind of beauty people trusted easily. Bright eyes, a low, soft voice, an unshowy smile, and the kind of attention that made people realize only afterward how much they had confessed. For years, she had been the first person I called when I broke up with someone, when I got pregnant and then lost it, when I moved apartments, when I got a new job, when I felt too small inside a city that asked too much. If Nora, in the polished versions of these stories, is the kind of woman who should have known better than to trust the wrong person, then those people forget that the deepest betrayals always come from the places that once held you for real. I called from the lawyer's parking lot, sitting in my car while rain tapped the windshield, my heart racing as if I had stolen something instead of been handed. Paige listened to everything without interrupting, only breathing in softly at exactly the right moments. And when I finished, she reacted too fast, too smoothly, in a way that even now I can see should have warned me at once. She did not ask why my aunt had done it. She did not ask if I was okay. She immediately asked how much the house was worth, whether the bakery carried any debt, whether Dean knew yet, and what Harold had said about the ownership structure and the timeline for disclosure. I remember hesitating a little, but at the time I only told myself Paige was more practical than I was, always the one with the notebook and pen while I sat there stunned by feeling. I haven't told anyone, I said. I just need 48 hours. I want to tell Mom myself before everybody hears it from someone else. Paige softened at once, so much that the slight earlier pause almost disappeared. Of course I won't tell anyone, she said. Jesus, Nora, I'm on your side. I actually exhaled in that car. I really did feel lighter. That is the most humiliating thing about trust. It lets your body relax before your mind catches up to the fact that you have just put your throat on the block. The next morning, my mother called at 8:13, a full hour earlier than she usually would, and her voice had already settled into that register she only ever used when she believed she had been wronged, but still wanted to appear as the decent person in the room. "When were you planning to tell me?" was the first thing she said. I sat upright in bed. "Tell you what?" My mother gave a short little laugh, the kind a person makes when there is nothing remotely funny left. "Nora, don't embarrass me further. The house, the bakery. Evelyn has not even been gone a week, and you decided to keep all of it from the family for what?" I remember exactly how the late morning light came through the blinds in a pale bar across the bedspread, how the unfinished glass of water from the night before sat on the table beside me, and how it felt as if my entire body had just dropped slowly through a layer of thick air. I did not have to ask who had told her. I knew immediately, not just because Paige was the only one who knew, but because the story had reached my mother altered. She was not asking whether I was okay carrying something that heavy. She was asking why I had hidden it, which meant someone had delivered the fact to her as a moral action, not a difficult event. I told her very slowly because I was afraid if I spoke faster I would start screaming, that I had only found out yesterday, that I had planned to come tell her myself, that I just needed a little time. My mother cut in. "Dean says you were planning to keep it all and use lawyers to shut everyone out." Dean, which meant Paige had not only told my mother, she had told Dean first or at the same time. That was the moment the pain changed shape for the first time. It was not just that the secret had been exposed. It had been sent ahead attached to an explanation of my motives. She didn't just tell them. I heard myself think, the thought cold and hard as a stone set in the center of my chest. She rewrote me. My mother's house that afternoon looked exactly like every afternoon of my childhood. The kind of fake normalcy that makes family betrayal sound unhinged when you try to tell it to outsiders. The same small gravel path, the same leftover Halloween wreath still hanging on the front door, the same cinnamon room spray in the entryway. Only the air had changed. The second I walked in, my mother stood in the kitchen with the face she usually wore when she had just come back from a parent-teacher meeting and discovered her child had lied on a report card. Dean sat at the dining table with his laptop open, shirt sleeves rolled up, holding himself like the kind of man who loves turning painful things into spreadsheets and calling that adulthood. Paige was there too. Of course she was. She stood near the counter holding a mug of tea, as if she had merely dropped by at the wrong time. But one look told me she had been there long enough to reset the tone of the entire room before I arrived. "Nora," she said too softly, "don't think of this as an ambush. Everyone just needs clarity." I looked straight at her. "You promised you wouldn't say anything." Paige did not blink. "Your cousin and your mother had a right to know before things went too far." The word right landed clean and sharp, like a knife wiped dry. Dean pulled out the chair opposite him and motioned for me to sit, then started talking like he was explaining a budget plan to someone less informed than himself. "No one's denying Evelyn loved you, but keeping both the house and the bakery is absurd. It needs to be appraised properly, sold properly, or developed in partnership. You do not have experience managing an asset like that." I sat only because my knees did not feel reliable. "She left it to me." Dean gave a small, contemptuous laugh. "She left it while she was old and sick. We all know how sentimental she got." My mother cut in immediately, sounding pained as if she were the one being forced into an unfair position. "This is not just about the asset. It's about the fact that you knew, you told Paige, and still let me hear about it from someone else. Try to understand how that looks." Paige set her mug down at once and stepped right into the opening she had made. Please don't make Nora more overwhelmed. She was panicking. When she called me, she was barely thinking straight. I was just afraid if we let it sit, she'd start hiding things, and then everything would get worse. That was the moment, that exact moment, when the way she turned herself into the mediator between me and the consequences she herself had manufactured made me understand in full that this was not an accident. It was a setup. She had stolen my right to tell the story first, then stepped in to manage the family's reaction to my supposed condition. And I was still stupid enough to feel, for one flickering instant, that I had to argue from the position of the unstable one. I'm not panicking, I said. Dean lifted an eyebrow. Paige tilted her head with a pity, so revolting it made my skin tight. Nora, you called me crying in your car. My mother looked at me right away, as if that alone confirmed everything else. I understood the game perfectly, but understanding does not save you from the humiliation of being stripped bare. It only makes the shame more precise. That night after I drove home, I sat alone in my apartment with the kitchen light glowing yellow, and the feeling that everything familiar had shifted half an inch. I went back through all the times Paige had asked me about Aunt Evelyn and the bakery over the last year. All the questions that had seemed so harmless, I could still remember feeling grateful for the interest. That bakery must be worth a lot by now. If your aunt can't keep it going one day, have you ever thought about rebranding it? There's an upstairs, too. That location is gorgeous. Has Dean ever talked about buying into it for a venture? I had answered everything. I had laughed, complained, told her about the old oven that kept breaking, about the regulars who hated even the smallest change to the signage, about the strip of land behind the building that could be turned into a little event space if someone really wanted to. At the time, I thought Paige was simply curious, the way she always was. Now, looking back over messages scattered across 2 years, I saw something else. Not curiosity, sounding like someone using the handle of a broom to test the depth of water before getting into a boat. I barely slept that night, not because I was afraid of losing the house, though that fear had already begun to take shape, but because something rawer had started to open underneath all of it. Paige had not only betrayed the secret after she heard it, she may have been building the conditions for that betrayal long before I knew. On the third day after that first confrontation, I went back to the bakery alone. The front glass was still fogged lightly with flour. The little bell on the door rang with the exact sound it had made for 20 years. And inside, the heavy smell of butter, coffee, and baked sugar tightened my throat almost instantly. Leela, the morning manager, looked at me with exhausted red eyes that were somehow still warm. I'm so sorry, she said, and without asking a single question, just leaned across the counter and hugged me. There are hugs that arrive at exactly the right moment and nearly make a person fall apart simply because they ask for no explanation. I sat with Leela at the little table by the back window after the crowd thinned out, listening to the espresso machine hiss dry while I gave her the short version of what I knew. Leela hesitated for a moment, then said there was something she thought I should have heard last week, though she had not known whether it mattered enough to say. Paige had come into the bakery twice in the last month of my aunt's life. Once on the very day I was driving my aunt to her MRI, and another time on an afternoon when Dean just happened to be there too. Both times they sat at the corner table near the pie shelf and talked quietly, but one of the servers caught a few phrases like revenue potential, brand cleanup, and if Nora gets emotional, that could slow everything down. I just sat there staring at the flower on the crease of Leela's sleeve and realized the story was filthier than I had thought. It was not just about the secret inheritance. Paige and Dean had been discussing the future of the property, while my aunt was still alive. I asked Leela if she was absolutely sure it had been paid. She nodded immediately. You remember people. She's the kind of pretty that makes everyone feel at ease, but her eyes did not feel at ease. That blunt little observation made me want to cry with gratitude. There is a small kind of rescue in having someone recognize the other person correctly without needing to go through the entire machinery of self-doubt first. That same afternoon, while I was still trying to compartmentalize this new piece of the truth, my phone rang again. This time it was Jenna, Paige's half-sister, someone I knew only well enough to exchange birthday texts with. Her voice was tense from the first word. I don't know how much you already know, Jenna said, but I think you should know Paige has been talking about you for a long time, not just about the inheritance. I went out behind the bakery and stood next to the recycling bin while Jenna spoke in that mixture of anger and shame people use when they have known for years that someone close to them is off in some deep way, but have never had the nerve to call it by its full name. Paige had been telling her own family for years that I attach to older women with money, that I know how to make vulnerable relatives feel chosen, and that if Aunt Evelyn left me anything, it's because Nora is good at performing loyalty. I leaned back against the cold brick wall and listened, and some darker, flatter kind of pain end up inside me, which meant the narrative about me had not begun yesterday, had not begun when the secret landed in Paige's hand, had not even begun when my aunt got sick. She had been preparing the ground for years, planting suspicion in places that were not directly relevant, so that by the time the moment came, my family and even outsiders believing I was calculating would not sound too strange. This didn't start yesterday, I whispered to myself after I hung up, and for the first time the pain turned fully into a kind of sharpness without tears. A person who betrays you in a single moment is one thing. A person who spends years making you smaller in other people's eyes changes the way you understand your whole past. From there, the financial motive began to surface even more clearly than the jealousy. Harold Whitmore agreed to see me again, this time not only in his role as the man who had read the will, but as someone who had decided to stop pretending everything could be solved through the genteel manners of family law. He opened the sealed backup packet from my aunt in front of me on a day of steady rain, the water hitting the office gutters with a rhythm so even it sounded almost mock. Inside, there was more than just the handwritten letter. There were records my aunt had kept of private conversations with Dean over the final 2 years of her life, clearly noting that he had twice presented proposals for a mixed-use redevelopment of the property, in which the bakery would survive only as a token storefront to harvest community goodwill before the model changed entirely. There was also an email Paige had sent directly to my aunt 3 months before she was hospitalized, sweet in tone, but faintly greedy at the core in a way only someone paying attention would catch. She proposed becoming a partner in a soft relaunch, rebranding the shop along heritage modern lines, adding brunch cocktails, hosting private events, and using the story of a legacy women-owned business as a marketing shell. My aunt had never answered. Instead, she printed the email, underlined several sections, and wrote in blue pen along the margin, "She smiles like she's offering help. She is measuring what can be taken." I had to fold the page down for a moment because it sounded too exactly like the way I had begun to understand Paige myself. Harold also handed me a written summary of a private meeting between him and my aunt, in which she named the 2 people she feared most would combine forces if she died before the legal structure was fully secure. Dean because of money and Paige because of control disguised as care. I looked up at Harold. "She knew about Paige," he nodded. "Your aunt knew people the way some women know weather. She did not always speak, but she noticed." Then he added, very slowly, like the sentence was not really meant to comfort me so much as to reposition the whole architecture of my pain. "This was never about a secret slipping, Nora. It was about 2 people who thought your grief would make you slow." That was when I fully understood the most frightening part. Paige did not simply want me to look worse in the eyes of my family, so I would not get to keep the whole property. She needed me to look unstable, sentimental, selfish, and hard to trust, so that any resistance I made against Dean and their plans would sound like panic instead of rightful ownership. She needed me to look unstable, not because it was true, because it was the cheapest and most efficient way to take power from a woman without ever having to call what they were doing theft. From that moment on, I stopped reacting and started planning. No more arguing on the phone, no more long texts to my mother, no more private confrontations with Paige, no more feeding her a single sentence she could drag elsewhere and reshape. I photographed, printed, organized, time-stamped, labeled chains of recipients. I pulled a voicemail from an old phone. One Paige had left the very morning after the secret got out, where she said in that familiar, tired but kind register of hers, "I really think if we all stay calm and don't let Nora spiral, we can find a fair outcome." I had a partial thread between Dean and my mother that she had accidentally forwarded to me, clearly saying, "Paige thinks Nora will hide behind sentiment if pressed." I had the email Paige sent my aunt, Leela's account of the meeting in the bakery, Jenna's information, Harold's documents, my aunt's letter. I also called Harold's litigation attorney, a woman named Celeste Monroe, whose voice was so even and clean you only had to listen for 3 minutes to know she was not afraid of people who had more money than she did, or were better at staging themselves. Celeste reviewed everything, sat in silence for 5 seconds, then said, "You do not need to defend yourself. You need to choose the right place so they can no longer control the atmosphere." That was when the idea of the meeting at the bakery took shape. Not at my mother's house, where Paige had already trained herself to play the mediator. Not in a lawyer's office, too cold and too private, but inside the bakery itself. The place both Dean and Paige had slowly begun to treat like a property game, while I knew every brick, every thread of cinnamon in the curtains, every chair that squeaked when you pulled it out. I wasn't going to defend myself. I thought the night before I sent the message inviting them. I was going to expose them. I called it a family meeting about next steps for the bakery, so that no one would have an excuse not to come, but no one would be overly alerted either. My mother came because she still hoped the whole thing could somehow be handled civilly. Dean came because he thought he was about to settle on an appraisal firm and push me into negotiation. Ruth came because she did not want to miss anything that might affect family legacy. Paige came, of course, because she had never once passed up a room where she thought she would get to shape the story first. I prepared the bakery that afternoon, but not in the way you prepare to host people. I simply cleared the central table, dimmed half the lights, and let the smell of fresh apple cake linger lightly in the room, because it was the nearest thing I had to something that could keep me standing there. Leela locked the door early and left us in the yellow glow over the wooden table that had held thousands of rounds of rolled dough. The second everyone sat down, the air itself felt tight. My mother set her handbag down too carefully. Dean opened his laptop too fast. Paige chose the chair between my mother and Dean as if it were instinct. But nothing is instinct with people like her. "Let's keep this productive," she said right away, her hand resting on her coffee cup like someone chairing a meeting. I looked at her for several seconds, then pulled my folder out of my bag. "Yes," I said, "let's talk about the truth." Paige stopped moving for the briefest beat, but I saw it. One beat was enough. I did not begin with the will or the asset. I began with the secret. I told them briefly about the day the will was read, how I told only one person the promise of 48 hours and my mother's call the next morning. Then I laid the first printed text from Paige on the table and let everyone lower their eyes to it for themselves. It was a message sent to Dean at 6:42 p.m. on the day I saw Harold, only 13 minutes after I had called Paige from the parking lot. "We need to talk before Nora locks this down with lawyers. She's going to turn sentimental and make it impossible." Dean looked up immediately. "How did you get that?" I turned to him without changing my tone. "From Paige's sister's old phone, which used to share a cloud account with Paige for years. Though really the better question is why you received this 13 minutes after I begged my best friend to keep my news private." No one answered. I went on with the message to my mother, then the voicemail about not letting Nora spiral, then the email Paige sent my aunt with the soft relaunch proposal, then the record of the meeting between Paige and Dean at the bakery that Leela had confirmed. I went slowly, slowly enough that each layer of disguise could no longer be flattened into misunderstanding. Paige tried to cut in at the third layer. "This is selective," I nodded. "Yes, I'm selecting the parts you thought no one would ever connect." By the fifth layer, when I read my aunt's notes in the margins out loud, my mother had started crying silently. Dean had stopped typing, one hand lying still on his now-shut laptop. Ruth was looking at Paige the way you look at something beautiful that turns out to be hollow inside. And then I brought out the last piece I had held back. The voicemail Paige had left my aunt a week before she died. A copy Harold had recovered from an old office archive. Paige's voice floated through the small bakery kitchen, sweet, low, almost tender. "I know Nora thinks this place is emotional, but if you ever want to do something more strategic with it, I'd love to help. Dean sees the upside too. I just don't want the future of the bakery trapped in sentiment." I let the silence after that stretch longer than comfort could tolerate. Then I looked at each of them in turn. "You didn't just tell my secret," I said to Paige. "You approached my aunt before she died. You talked to Dean before this happened. You built a story about me being sentimental, unstable, selfish, and hard to trust long before the secret ever landed in your hands. So that when it finally did, all you had to do was lift the lid." Paige still tried to gaslight her way back out, exactly as I knew she would. "Nora, you're building intent out of fragments." I laughed for the first time, a humorless sound but sharp enough to make her hesitate. "Intent?" I pushed my aunt's letter toward my mother. "She wrote your name in this. She described exactly what you were before you even finished becoming it." Paige turned immediately toward my mother, choosing the familiar battlefield. "Mrs. Calloway, please. You know how emotional Nora gets when she feels cornered." And that was the line that made the last misunderstanding die in my mother's eyes. She had heard some version of that sentence too many times over too many months, and now, spoken across a table full of evidence, it no longer sounded like concern. It sounded like a tool. Dean tried to salvage the room by jumping to what he thought he could still control. Even if Paige mishandled things, that doesn't change the practical reality. The property is still too much for you to hold alone. I turned toward him, and for the first time that night, let my voice sharpen. "Do you really still think this is a property negotiation?" Dean looked back at me, jaw tightening. "It is a financial decision." "No," I said. "It is proof that you are willing to use other people, including Paige, including me, as long as it gets you what you want faster." Dean gave a scornful little laugh, but the sound did not land cleanly. "You're being dramatic." I pulled out the final sealed addendum from the legal file. "Good. Then let's do the less dramatic part." The addendum showed that my aunt had officially barred any transfer, partnership, restructuring, or sale of the property in the first 3 years after her death, unless I was the one to authorize it, precisely because certain family members and outside influences have shown interest inconsistent with preservation. I laid the paper down in front of Dean. "You didn't just lose morally, you lost on paper too." Across the table, Paige finally lost color. Not crying, not shaking, just the loss of that controlled light people like her live on. "You've been planning this?" she said, almost under her breath. I met her eyes. "No, you're the one who planned this. I'm just the one who suffered long enough to learn how to read it." The real explosion did not come from me. It came from my mother who had spent her whole life believing in moderate decency, in dinner on time, in the fantasy that no one in her family would ever go far enough to truly soil their hands as long as everyone kept their voices low. Finally lifted her face from my aunt's letter with an expression I had never seen on her before. Not exactly anger, something closer to horror. "How long," she asked Paige, "how long have you been doing this?" Paige opened her mouth, shut it, then chose the worst possible move, half a truth just large enough to hope it might save some part of her image. "I was trying to keep things from becoming chaos." My mother set the letter down. "That is not what I asked." Her voice was not loud, but for the first time in months, I heard something there that was not fatigue or mediation. I heard a boundary. Paige looked to Dean as if searching for a final ally. Dean looked away. That was the moment she truly lost. Not when the evidence came out, but when the man she thought would at least help her keep calling everything practical chose silence instead. Ruth stood up from her chair, set her napkin on the table, and said, in a voice old but so clean everyone had to hear it, "You used concern like a weapon." That sentence shut the final lid on the narrative Paige had lived inside for years. Concern, care, clarity, stability, every word she loved now named correctly at once for what it had really been. A weapon. After that night, the bakery did not collapse in noise. It sank into a very thick silence. My mother stayed behind with me after everyone left, both of us drinking coffee that had gone bitter and cold without either of us bothering to replace it. She apologized, but an apology given after months of my standing alone in the middle of a war cannot instantly repair anything. I knew she meant it. I also knew meaning it did not restore a thing. 3 days later, Dean texted me a longer message than I had ever gotten from him in my life, half explanation and half self-defense, saying he had only wanted to make sure the asset didn't die with Evelyn. I did not answer. Ruth sent white carnations and a handwritten note saying she had been too eager for a story that felt neat and had forgotten to look at the actual person caught inside. Jenna texted me one line, "I'm sorry I didn't speak sooner." Paige disappeared for exactly a week and then sent me an email. No call, no text, only email. Because email lets people like her polish each line until it sounds just remorseful enough while still leaving an exit. She wrote that she had handled things badly, that she had genuinely believed I would collapse under the pressure, that everything had spiraled beyond intention, and of course that Dean had also encouraged certain conversations. By that point, I had to set my phone down because I was so close to laughing out loud. Even after being fully exposed, she still could not stop redistributing blame just enough to shrink herself slightly at the center of the explosion. Not because she did not understand what she had done, but because some people can only keep living if they still get to believe they are the most reasonable person in the room, even after the room has seen them too clearly to sustain the illusion. I saw Paige one last time 6 weeks later, in the most deliberate sense of the phrase. An actual arranged meeting to end things. Not at my mother's house. Not at the bakery. I chose a small park near the river on a pale, sad late April afternoon. Paige arrived in a beige trench coat, her hair tied back low, looking more tired and somehow more beautiful in that sharpened way people do when they have lived too long off self-command, and suddenly no longer have enough people around them to believe in it. We sat at opposite ends of a wooden bench with a gap between us, so precise it felt like the right measurement of all things that cannot be mended. Paige did not circle as much as I thought she might, maybe because she understood that with me. By then, every soft layer of language had burned out. "Do you hate me?" she asked after several minutes of looking out at the river. And it was honestly the most absurd question she could have asked after everything, not because it was stupid, but because it still centered her feelings about the way I carried her in my head. I looked at her profile, at the woman who had once slept on a dorm floor with me, held my hair back when I threw up after a drunk night at 21, known exactly when I needed black coffee, and when I needed ginger tea, and who had also taken every weakness I ever placed in her hands and carved them into keys that opened rooms all my life. "No," I said, "I just don't trust you anymore." Paige gave a small smile, sad in the way people are sad when they no longer have any place left to perform their goodness. "That's worse," I nodded. "Yes." She was quiet for a long time before she said the only thing that night that sounded even close to truth. "I thought if I could control how people saw you, I wouldn't feel so invisible around you." I looked straight out at the gray river, the wind breaking and closing the rings on the water. I understood that sentence. I understood it in a terrible, intimate way. And because I understood it, I also knew there was nothing else to say. There are motives that can be explained and still do absolutely nothing to redeem the harm they generate. I stood up first and pulled my coat tighter around me. Paige did not try to stop me. She did not ask for more. She did not cry. We walked away from the bench in opposite directions, and the space between our backs at that moment felt like the nearest thing to a final truth either of us was ever going to get. The bakery reopened fully under my control at the beginning of summer, not as some bright, triumphant ending. As a decision, I repainted the old green doorframe my aunt had loved, kept the original sign, replaced the espresso machine, repaired the downstairs oven, hired 2 more people, and killed once and for all the rebrand idea Dean and Paige had both circled so hungrily, as if wrapping the word heritage in a few thin fonts could automatically create value. I kept the chair by the window, where my aunt always did the books in the afternoons, kept the bell on the door, kept the thick cinnamon smell in the early morning, kept the particular hush the bakery fell into around 4 o'clock, before the last tray of cookies came out. People in town kept coming. Some asked careful little questions, some asked nothing, but looked at me a second longer than they used to, as if checking whether the old rumors still had any bones left in them. I met their gaze, smiled with just enough courtesy, and went back to weighing flour. Slowly, things did not go back to what they had been. They simply stopped revolving around the distorted version of me anymore. That is not healing. It is just enough room to live. There are mornings when I unlock the door before sunrise, when Willow Street is still quiet and the first light cuts across the front glass, and I truly feel a kind of dry, solid clarity settling downward inside me. I lost a friend. I lost the naive belief that a secret placed into the right hands will naturally remain safe. I lost the uncomplicated kind of trust I used to have in my own family. But I got my voice back before it dried out completely. Not through shouting, not through noisy revenge, just by forcing the truth to stand somewhere of its own. If anyone asks me what the worst part of all this was, I will not say the secret getting out, and I will not say Paige trying to work her way into the property. Both were ugly, but both still belong to a category of ugliness people understand pretty easily. The worst part was that she took what I gave her at my softest moment and used it to reconstruct me in front of other people. She did not only tell them I had inherited something. She told them I was greedy, panicked, selfish, unstable, and hard to trust. And once someone you trust does that early enough and skillfully enough, you do not only lose the secret, you lose those first few seconds in other people's eyes, before they have even had the chance to hear your real voice. It took me a very long time to understand that this was what she had truly wanted. Not the house, not the bakery, the right to decide which version of me would get to live in other people's heads. She thought telling my secret would give her control, but in the end, all it really did was expose who she was under a light so unforgiving not even the softest voice could cover it. And me, I kept living. I opened the bakery every morning. I signed flour invoices, ran payroll, tested new fillings, talked to customers, called my mother back just enough, not more than that. From the outside, people would call that fine. Inside, it is different. Some layers of trust, once burned, do not grow back out of the same material. I do not tell my softest truths to anyone anymore, just because they speak in the right tone. I do not confuse being listened to with being kept safe. I do not believe a secret is protected simply because it is spoken quietly. But maybe that cost is still better than the alternative, which is letting other people continue to hold your story and call it concern. I lost a friend. I lost a gentler, more gullible version of myself, but I held on to something harder than either of those things. I held on to the right to decide, in the end, what in my life is true, and who no longer gets to put their hands on it.